The air in the courtroom was stale, thick with the unbreathed words of 100 preceding tragedies. It clung to the heavy oak paneling and the worn velvet of the pews, a silent testament to lives fractured and futures stolen. I sat on the hard bench, my spine a rod of iron, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were bone white. 3 years. For 3 years, I had been a ghost in my own life, haunted by the ghost of my son. And now, across the room, sat the two people who had made us both ghosts, my husband, Robert, and my daughter-in-law, Sarah. They thought they were so clever. They glanced at each other, a flicker of shared confidence, a silent reassurance that their story would hold. They believed their lies were a fortress. They had no idea I possessed the key to its gate, a key forged in the digital fires of their own whispered treachery. When the judge finally turned his gaze to me, his expression a mixture of judicial weariness and faint curiosity, I gave a single sharp nod to my nephew, Danny. He rose, and in the suffocating silence of that courtroom, he pressed play. The first sound was the clink of a coffee cup against a saucer, a mundane, domestic sound that made the horror to come even more obscene. Then, Sarah's voice, breathy and conspiratorial. "When you suggested the break lines, I thought you were crazy." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Robert's face, a carefully constructed mask of a grieving stepfather, shattered into 1,000 pieces of raw panic. Sarah's went the color of bleached bone. They thought their secret was buried 6 feet under with my son. They were wrong. It was alive, and it was about to bury them. If you're watching this, if you've ever felt the kind of grief that hollows you out until you're nothing but a shell, subscribe. Let me know where you're watching from, because this isn't just my story. It's a story for anyone who has ever been betrayed by the people they were supposed to trust the most. Let me backtrack. Let me tell you how a 64-year-old widow from a sleepy town in Ohio, a woman whose biggest excitement was her prize-winning roses, became the architect of a downfall so complete, so absolute, it would echo in this town for generations. It started, as so many tragedies do, with love, and then with grief. The kind of grief that is a physical presence, a cold shadow that follows you from room to room. It makes you do crazy things. It makes you reorganize your dead son's bedroom for the 1,000th time, touching his old football jerseys, running your fingers over the spines of his college textbooks, trying to absorb some lingering essence of him, some proof that he was ever here at all. Michael had been gone for 3 years, 1,095 days of waking up with the immediate, crushing realization that he was not coming back. Each day was a mountain to be climbed, and at its peak, there was no triumphant view, only the prospect of climbing it again tomorrow. His room was my sanctuary and my torture chamber. The scent of his laundry detergent still clung faintly to the clothes in his closet. His posters of classic cars were still tacked to the walls. I couldn't bring myself to pack it away. Packing it away felt like a final goodbye, a betrayal of his memory. It felt like admitting he was truly, irrevocably gone. Maybe that's why I was up there on that grey March afternoon, the sky outside weeping a slow, miserable drizzle that matched the eternal weather in my soul. I was holding his old baseball trophy, the cheap plastic figure frozen mid-swing, remembering the summer he was 12, and believed with every fiber of his being that he would be the next Cal Ripken Jr. That's when I heard them downstairs. It was Robert's laugh first, a deep rolling sound that used to be the bedrock of my life. Now it just sounded hollow, foreign. It was followed by Sarah's giggle, a breathy, feminine sound that twisted something sharp and ugly in my gut. My daughter-in-law, Michael's widow, she had been coming by more often lately, always with my granddaughter, little Emma, in tow, a beautiful, innocent shield. Always with some flimsy excuse, a leaky faucet, a question about taxes, needing help assembling a toy. I'd seen it as a cry for help, for connection. I thought she was just lonely, still drowning in her own grief for Michael, clinging to the remnants of his family. How naive I was. How utterly, devastatingly blind. She's getting suspicious. Sarah's voice drifted up the stairwell, clearer now. They had moved into the kitchen, which was directly below Michael's room. The floorboards seemed to vibrate with her words. I froze, the baseball trophy clutched in my hand, my breath caught in my throat. My heart began a frantic panic drumming against my ribs. Suspicious about what? I was suspicious of nothing but the cruel randomness of fate. Margaret doesn't suspect a thing. Robert's voice was confident, dismissive, laced with an arrogance that chilled me to the bone. She's too wrapped up in her shrine to Michael to notice what's happening right under her nose. A shrine. He called my love, my grief, a shrine. The words were a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. My hand started shaking, a violent tremor I couldn't control. I set the trophy down on the dusty dresser, my movements slow, deliberate. I was afraid the slightest sound, a creak of the floorboards, the rattle of the trophy against the wood, would give me away. I flattened myself against the wall, straining to hear. A desperate eavesdropper on the ruins of my own life. It's been over a year since we started this, Robert. When are we going to tell her? Tell me what? My heart hammered so hard I was sure they could hear it downstairs, a frantic SOS from a sinking ship. Tell me what? That you found comfort in each other? I might have even understood that, in a painful, grudging way. Grief does strange things to people. Soon, baby. But we have to be smart about this. Margaret has money. Michael's inheritance, the house. I'm going to need my half of everything when we divorce. Divorce. The word didn't just hit me, it detonated inside me. I gripped the edge of Michael's old oak desk, my legs suddenly turning to water. The room swayed, the posters on the wall blurring into streaks of color. Divorce. 40 years of marriage, of building a life, of raising a son, of shared joys, and whispered secrets in the dark. And he was discussing it with my son's wife, like a business transaction. He wanted a divorce. For Sarah. My Michael's Sarah. But then, she said something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. Something that stopped the world from spinning and plunged me into a cold, silent void. I just wish we didn't have to wait so long after what happened to Michael. There was a heavy pause, a silence thick with unspoken meaning. When Robert spoke again, his voice was softer, more careful, a conspirator's whisper. We agreed. We'd wait 3 years. It's only been 3 years to the day. Any sooner would have looked suspicious. Suspicious. That word again. It slithered into my mind, a venomous snake. Why would their relationship look suspicious? Michael had died in a tragic car accident on a mountain road. A freak brake failure. That's what the police report said. What did that have to do with them? I know, but I still can't believe it worked. When you suggested the brake lines, I thought you were crazy. The world tilted on its axis and fell away beneath me. I grabbed onto Michael's desk chair, my knuckles white, the only thing keeping me from collapsing to the floor. Brake lines. They were talking about brake lines, my son's brake lines. It was the perfect plan, Robert continued, and I could hear the sickening pride in his voice, the self-congratulatory tone of a man admiring his own dark work. Everyone knows Michael was always tinkering with that old Mustang. One little cut, in just the right place. I clapped a hand over my mouth, stifling a scream that clawed its way up my throat, a raw, guttural sound of pure animal horror. No, it couldn't be. My mind refused to process it. They weren't talking about my Michael. They were talking about a movie they'd seen, a book they'd read. This wasn't my life. Sometimes I wonder if he knew. Sarah's voice was dreamy now, a horrifyingly wistful tone. In those last few seconds, before the crash, do you think he realized what was happening? Does it matter? Robert's tone was cold, clinical, utterly devoid of emotion. He's gone. Emma thinks her daddy died in an accident, and now we can finally be together. Everything worked out exactly like we planned. I must have made a sound then, a choked sob, a strangled gasp. The conversation downstairs stopped abruptly. I heard the scrape of a chair, then footsteps moving across the kitchen floor. The back door opened and closed. Sarah was leaving, taking her sweet, innocent daughter with her, away from the house where her father's murder had just been recounted with such chilling nonchalance. I sank into Michael's desk chair, my body trembling uncontrollably. I stared at the walls, at the framed photos of his life. Michael in his graduation cap and gown, his smile so wide and full of promise. Michael holding a tiny, newborn Emma, his eyes shining with a love so fierce it was almost painful to see. My son, my beautiful, kind, hard-working son. The boy who loved that old Mustang more than anything, who had spent countless weekends in the garage with Robert, their heads bent together under the hood, talking about carburetors and engine compression and brake lines. Robert, his stepfather, the man who had mentored him, who had taught him, who knew exactly which line to cut. And Sarah, the woman he adored, the mother of his child, who had been sleeping with my husband while my son was still alive. Both of them, they had murdered my son. And then, they had waited. 3 years. 3 years of my unendurable grief. 3 years of me leaning on my husband for support. 3 years of me comforting my widowed daughter-in-law. 3 years of living with his killer, sleeping next to him every night, sharing meals with him, accepting his hollow words of comfort while my heart was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. That's when I realized the conversation I had just heard, the one that had just destroyed my world, was about to become their biggest mistake. Because what they didn't know, what Robert in his infinite arrogance had forgotten, was that I had been recording everything in this house for the past 8 months. After a pair of break-ins last summer, just some local teenagers, we thought, I'd become unnerved. Robert was traveling so much for work, always on a case, and I felt vulnerable alone in the big house. I'd insisted on a state-of-the-art security system, the kind with high-definition cameras and, more importantly, voice-activated audio recording in every main room. The security consultant had explained it was for insurance purposes, to capture every detail in case of another incident. Robert had complained about the cost, of course. An unnecessary expense, Margaret, he'd grumbled, but I'd held firm. For my peace of mind, I'd told him. If only I'd known. What kind of peace of mind it would actually bring me. Now, sitting in the ruins of my life in Michael's room, I realized that every hushed conversation, every whispered secret between Robert and Sarah for the past 8 months was stored on a hard drive in the hall closet. My limbs felt like lead, but a new, cold resolve was beginning to crystallize in my veins, pushing out the shock and horror. I made my way downstairs, my hand trailing along the wall for support. The control panel was in the coat closet. The security guy had shown me how to access the recordings, a feature I'd never imagined needing. It took me 3 tries to get the password right. My fingers were shaking so badly. Michael's birthday, 0815. The screen lit up, displaying a list of files, organized by date, time, and room. My eyes scanned the list, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There it was. March 15th, kitchen audio, 3:47 p.m. With a trembling finger, I clicked play. Their voices filled the small, dark closet, crystal clear and utterly, damnably incriminating. Every single word, the break lines, waiting 3 years, Michael's final, terrifying moments. I listened to the entire thing twice, tears streaming down my face, hot and silent. But these weren't just tears of grief anymore. They were tears of rage. But I didn't stop there. He'd said they'd been doing this for over a year. There had to be more. I scrolled back, month by month, my own personal history of betrayal laid out in digital files. I found the first recording of them together alone in the house on August 3rd, 2024. Just 2 months after Robert had started working late so frequently. Sarah's voice was excited, breathless. "He suspected something, Robert. Yesterday, he asked me why I was always coming over here when he was at work." Robert's reply was smooth, confident. "Michael's not stupid, but he loves you. That makes him blind to what he doesn't want to see." I fast-forwarded through dozens of recordings, a sickening montage of their affair. Love talk intertwined with discussions about Michael's life insurance policy, a policy worth $500,000. They planned secret meetings, laughed about close calls, and all the while, I was living in the same house, oblivious, drowning in my sorrow. And then, on January 18th, 2025, I found it. The conversation that made my blood run cold. "We can't keep this up forever," Sarah had said, her voice tight with anxiety. "What if he finds out? What if he divorces me? I'll lose everything. I'll lose Emma." "He won't divorce you," Robert had answered. "Michael's not like that. He'd try to work it out. He'd suggest counseling. He'd fight for his marriage." His voice was thoughtful, calculating. Unless what? Unless he wasn't around to fight for it. The silence on the recording stretched for so long I thought the system had cut out. Then Sarah spoke, her voice barely a whisper, a thread of sound thick with horror and temptation. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that accidents happen, Sarah," Robert had replied, his voice calm and reasonable. "Especially to people who spend a lot of time working under old cars. My son, they were planning to murder my son, and they were discussing it with the same casual tone they might use to decide what to have for dinner. I sat in that dark closet for hours, the air growing thick and suffocating, as I downloaded and documented every relevant conversation. The recordings painted a gruesome, detailed masterpiece of a year-long affair that had escalated into cold-blooded, premeditated murder the moment they realized Michael was starting to see through their lies. The worst part wasn't the murder plot, as insane as that sounds. It was the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it, the way they mocked my grief, my love for my son. In one recording from February, Sarah actually laughed while describing how she'd managed to produce such convincing tears at Michael's funeral. "I should get an Academy Award," she'd giggled. Robert had chuckled along with her. "You were very convincing. Even Margaret hugged you and said how glad she was that Michael had found someone who loved him so much." I remembered that moment, standing in the cold, damp earth of the cemetery, the air heavy with the scent of lilies and freshly turned soil. I had held Sarah as she sobbed into my shoulder, her small body trembling. I had whispered in her ear, "You are the daughter I never had. We will get through this together." I had grieved for her loss as much as my own, thinking how lucky Michael had been to have a wife who loved him so deeply. And it had all been a performance, a well-rehearsed lie. By 6 o'clock that evening, I had compiled over 3 hours of recordings, a timeline of treachery stretching from August 2024 to that very afternoon. It was enough evidence to prove conspiracy, premeditated murder, and insurance fraud. Enough to destroy them both, to see them rot in a prison cell for the rest of their miserable lives. But I didn't call the police. Not yet. Because first, I wanted them to know that I knew. I wanted to see their faces when the carefully constructed world they'd built on my son's grave came crashing down around them. I wanted them to feel a fraction of the terror Michael must have felt in his final moments. I wanted them to suffer. What they didn't know about me, what Robert had forgotten after 40 years of marriage, was that I am not a fragile, grief-stricken old woman. I hadn't spent 4 decades married to an insurance investigator, a man who prided himself on spotting fraud and deception without learning a few things about evidence, patience, and the art of setting a perfect trap. For the next 2 weeks, I became an actress worthy of Broadway. I moved through my days like a phantom, my actions a perfect mimicry of my old life, my mind a cold, calculating machine. Morning coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, my stomach churning with bile. Afternoon gardening, my hands digging into the cool earth, planting new life while my mind plotted the end of theirs. Evening news with Robert, sitting beside him on the sofa, the warmth of his body a repulsive reminder of his betrayal. I made dinner every night. I asked about his day, feigning interest in his fabricated business trips and insurance cases. I even helped Sarah with Emma when she called, my voice warm and grandmotherly, while my heart felt like a shard of ice. The only difference was that now, the recording system was my ally. I was baiting them, intentionally steering conversations towards Michael, towards the accident, towards our shared grief. I was just thinking about Michael today, I'd say, my voice trembling with practiced sorrow. I still wish I knew what really happened that night. It all felt so sudden. Sarah would rush to comfort me, her hand on my arm, her eyes full of fake sympathy. "Don't do this to yourself, Margaret. It was an accident. A horrible, tragic accident." Robert would pat my shoulder, his touch making my skin crawl. "She's right, honey. We have to accept the things we can't change." Every comforting word, every sympathetic gesture was another nail in their coffins. And I was recording it all. During those 2 weeks, I did my homework. I called my nephew Danny, the criminal defense attorney in Columbus. I fabricated a story about updating my will, wanting to understand some legal concepts. "Just hypothetically, Danny," I'd said, "what are the laws in Ohio about recording conversations in your own home?" "Aunt Margaret, are you okay?" he'd asked, a hint of concern in his voice. "Perfectly fine, dear. Just getting my affairs in order." "Well," he'd said, "Ohio is a one-party consent state. That means as long as one person in the conversation consents to the recording, it's legal. And since you live in the house, you're always a consenting party. The recordings would be admissible in court." Perfect. I also managed to get a copy of the original police report from Michael's accident. The investigating officer had noted the brake failure was consistent with normal wear and tear on a vehicle of that age. No further investigation had been deemed necessary. Of course not. Who would suspect a loving stepfather and a grieving widow? They had counted on that. They had weaponized our family's love and trust against us. But the most interesting, most damning discovery was about the life insurance policy. Sarah had claimed the $500,000 6 months after Michael's death, which was standard. What wasn't standard was that a large portion of that money had been used to pay off debts I never knew Michael had. It took some digging, some careful calls to old family friends who worked in banking, but I found the truth. They weren't Michael's debts, they were Robert's. Gambling debts, transferred into Michael's name through a series of forged documents I was sure Robert had created. He hadn't just killed my son, he had stolen his identity to cover his own vices, and then used the blood money to pay them off. The web of deception was deeper and darker than I could have ever imagined. On March 30th, exactly 2 weeks after my world had ended for a second time, I decided it was time. I invited them both over for Sunday dinner, a family tradition they had helped me destroy. Sarah arrived first with Emma, who immediately ran to hug my legs, a tiny, perfect whirlwind of innocence. My heart broke for her. She was the one true victim in all of this, a little girl who adored her mother and her grandpa Robert, blissfully unaware of the monsters they truly were. "Grandma Margaret, can we make cookies?" she asked, her big blue eyes, so much like Michael's, sparkling with excitement. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, kissing the top of her head, inhaling the sweet, clean scent of her hair. "But first, why don't you go play in the living room? Mommy and I need to talk for a few minutes." Sarah settled at the kitchen table, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. She was starting to believe they'd gotten away with it. "You know, Margaret," she began, her tone casual, "I've been thinking, it might be time for Robert and me to start spending more time together, openly. As friends, of course, supporting each other." The sheer audacity of it stole my breath. She was laying the groundwork, testing the waters for their public relationship right here in my kitchen. the room where they'd plotted to murder my son. "That sounds lovely, dear," I said, my voice smooth as silk as I put the kettle on for tea. "Grief can be so isolating. It's good to have someone who understands." "Exactly," she said, her smile bright and nauseatingly genuine. "Robert's been such a comfort. Sometimes I think Michael would be happy knowing we're taking care of each other." I had to turn away to hide the fury that contorted my face. Michael would be happy. The son she'd murdered would be happy that his widow was sleeping with the man who cut his brake lines. The blasphemy of it was staggering. Robert arrived just as I was serving the tea. He kissed my cheek, the casual, familiar gesture of a husband of 40 years. It took every ounce of my self-control not to recoil. He played with Emma, tossing her in the air until she shrieked with laughter. The perfect picture of a grieving stepfather, an adoring grandfather, a monster in disguise. We ate pot roast. Emma chatted about kindergarten. Sarah talked about a house she'd just sold. Robert discussed a complex insurance case he was working on. It was a perfectly normal family dinner, a tableau of lies. I sat across from them, my son's murderers, and I made small talk. After Emma was safely absorbed in cartoons in the living room, I brought out dessert. Michael's favorite, chocolate cake with chocolate frosting. "I thought it would be nice to honor his memory," I said, my voice soft. Sarah's eyes immediately filled with crocodile tears. "Oh, Margaret, that's so sweet. He would have loved this." "Yes," I agreed, setting the cake on the table. "I think he would have. Just like he would have loved knowing the truth about what really happened to him." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew thick, heavy. Robert's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Sarah's practiced smile became strained, brittle. "What do you mean, Margaret?" Robert asked, his voice cautious. I didn't answer. Instead, I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where a small digital recorder I'd placed there earlier sat waiting. With a deliberate, steady hand, I pressed play. "When you suggested the brake lines, I thought you were crazy." Sarah's voice filled the cozy kitchen. She went as white as fresh snow, her fork clattering onto her plate. Robert's face hardened, the charming mask melting away to reveal the cold, dangerous man beneath. "Turn it off, Margaret," he said, his voice a low, threatening growl. I let it play. It was the perfect plan. One little cut in just the right place. I watched the blood drain from their faces, the dawning horror in their eyes. I let it play for another 30 seconds, until we reached the part where they discussed Michael's final, terrified moments. Then I pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute. 23 recordings, I said, my voice conversational as I sat back down at the table. Spanning almost 8 months, every sordid detail of your affair, your planning, and your execution of my son's murder. You should have seen their faces. Sarah looked like she was going to be physically sick, and Robert looked like he was calculating how quickly he could get to me and smash that recorder into a million pieces. "Margaret," he began slowly, his voice taking on that reasonable, condescending tone he always used when he was trying to manipulate someone. "I think you've misunderstood what you heard." I almost laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Even now, caught red-handed, his instinct was to lie, to gaslight me. "Have I?" I picked up the recorder, holding it as if it were a precious jewel. In that moment, it was. "So, when Sarah said, 'When you suggested the brake lines, I thought you were crazy,' what exactly was she talking about? A plumbing issue?" Sarah finally found her voice, a pathetic, strangled whisper. "Margaret, please, just listen." "Oh, I have been listening, dear," I said, my voice dropping, laced with steel. "For 8 months, apparently. Did you know that while you two were in this very kitchen, planning to kill my son, I was upstairs in his bedroom, going through his things, trying to decide what to keep and what to give away, because my grief was so overwhelming I could barely function. Did you ever think of that?" The last bit of color drained from Sarah's face. "You want to know the really sick part?" I continued, surprised by how steady my voice was, how clear and cold. I actually felt sorry for you, Sarah. I thought you were a poor, grieving single mother. I babysat Emma for you. I helped you with your car payments when money was tight. I brought you casseroles. Margaret, Robert started again. I'm not finished. The roar that came out of me silenced him instantly. I held you, Sarah, while you cried at my son's funeral. I told you that you were like the daughter I never had. I watched you comfort Emma when she asked where her daddy went, and I thought, what a wonderful mother she is, helping her child through such a tragedy. And it was all a lie, a sick, twisted performance. Sarah started to cry then, real tears this time, tears of pure, unadulterated fear. I turned my gaze on Robert. And you sat with me on countless nights when I couldn't sleep, when the grief was a physical weight on my chest, eating me alive. You held me while I cried and told me that Michael wouldn't want me to blame myself. You told me not to torture myself, wondering if I should have seen the signs that something was wrong with his car. Robert's jaw was a tight, hard line. You don't understand the whole situation. Don't I? I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garage. The garage where Michael had spent so many happy hours. The garage where Robert had crept in like a coward in the night and sentenced my son to death. What I understand is that my son was getting suspicious about his wife's frequent visits to his stepfather's house. What I understand is that instead of ending your pathetic, sordid affair, you two decided that murder was the easier option. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Sarah whispered, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. I spun around to face her. Oh, I'm sorry. Was there a better way to murder my son? Please, enlighten me. We never meant for him to get hurt, she sobbed. We fell in love. And Michael, he never would have understood. So you killed him. The words hung in the air, cold and sharp as an executioner's blade. It was supposed to be an accident. Sarah's voice rose to near hysteria. Just a little accident, something that would put him in the hospital for a while. Give us time to figure things out, to tell people. A little accident, I repeated, staring at her in utter disbelief. You cut the brake lines on his car, Sarah. On a winding mountain road. What in God's name did you think was going to happen? Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. This conversation is over. You can't prove a thing. Those recordings could be anything. I smiled then. It was probably the first genuine smile I'd had in 3 years, and it was terrifying. Can't I? I've already made copies, Robert. Multiple copies stored in multiple safe places. And my nephew Danny, you remember Danny, the criminal defense attorney? He's reviewed everything. He finds it all very compelling. The room went dead silent, except for the faint, cheerful sound of cartoons from the other room. What do you want? Robert's voice was flat, hollow, defeated. The fight had gone out of him. He knew he was trapped. What do I want? I echoed, my voice thick with 3 years of unshed tears. I want my son back. I want the last 3 years of my life back, the years I spent consumed by guilt and agony, wondering if I could have done something to prevent his death. I want to undo the moment I held Sarah at Michael's funeral and told her she was family. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. Since I can't have any of that, I'll settle for justice. Margaret, please, Sarah begged, her eyes wide with terror. Think about Emma. Think about what this will do to her. That was the wrong thing to say. The absolute, irrevocably wrong thing to say. A cold, hard rage I didn't know I possessed surged through me. You should have thought about Emma before you murdered her father. My voice was so cold it could have frozen fire. You should have thought about how she would have to grow up without him. How she would ask questions about her daddy that you would have to lie about for the rest of your miserable life. You forfeited the right to use her name as a shield the moment you decided her father's life was an inconvenience. I picked up my phone from the counter and started dialing. Who are you calling? Robert demanded, taking a step toward me. Detective Morrison. I believe he was the lead investigator on Michael's case. I think he'll be very interested in some new evidence that has come to light. Robert lunged for my phone, but rage and adrenaline are powerful motivators. I was faster than he expected. I sidestepped him, holding the phone out of his reach. "Don't," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "Emma is 10 feet away in the living room. Do you really want her to see her grandfather assault her grandmother right before you're both arrested for murdering her father?" The look in his eyes told me that yes, he probably did. But the mention of Emma stopped him. He froze, his hands clenched into fists, his chest heaving. I finished dialing and put the phone to my ear, my eyes locked on his. When the detective answered, I said the words I had been rehearsing in my mind for 2 weeks, the words that would sign their fate. "Detective Morrison, this is Margaret Foster. I have new evidence regarding the death of my son, Michael Foster. Evidence that proves he was murdered." The silence in my kitchen was deafening, but from the living room, I could hear Emma laughing at her cartoons, blissfully unaware that her entire world was about to be ripped apart, just as mine had been 3 years ago. Detective Morrison arrived 30 minutes later, his face a mask of professional gravity. He came with another officer and a technician from the forensics unit. I had sent Emma home with Sarah before they arrived, a surreal and painful exchange on the front porch. Sarah could barely speak, her hands shaking as she buckled Emma into her car seat. "Margaret, please, I'm begging you. There has to be another way," she'd whispered, her face a mess of tears and desperation. "There was," I had replied, my voice devoid of any warmth. It was called not murdering my son. Robert, on the other hand, had shifted from panicked aggressor to arrogant legal strategist. As we waited in the tense silence for the police to arrive, he tried to intimidate me. "You'll never be able to prove intent, Margaret. Conversations can be taken out of context. Any decent lawyer will tear this so-called evidence apart. It's your word against ours." "We'll see," was all I said, refusing to engage with his pathetic attempts at control. Now, watching Detective Morrison in my study, a pair of headphones over his ears, his expression growing darker and more grim with every passing second of the recording, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 long years. It was a fragile, unfamiliar feeling, but I recognized it. It was hope. After listening to just the first 5-minute recording, he took the headphones off and looked at me, his eyes sharp and focused. "Mrs. Foster, I need to ask you some questions. When were these audio files made? Have they been altered in any way? And why are we only hearing about this now?" I answered everything, my voice calm and steady. I explained about the security system installed after the break-ins. I assured him they were completely unaltered, timestamped by the system itself. I told him I had discovered them 2 weeks ago. The other officer, a younger man with a skeptical look, chimed in. "Why did you wait 2 weeks to call us? If you believed you had evidence of a murder, why not report it immediately?" I looked him straight in the eye, my gaze unwavering. "Because I lived with one of the murderers for 40 years. I know how manipulative he is. I knew one conversation could be explained away as a sick joke, a fantasy, a misunderstanding. But 23 conversations detailing the affair, the financial motive, the planning, the execution, and their post-murder analysis of my son's final moments. That's a little harder to dismiss as a simple misunderstanding." Detective Morrison was scribbling furiously in his notepad. "We're going to need to take the entire security system hard drive as evidence. We'll need a formal, recorded statement from you. Mrs. Foster, this is no longer a cold case. This is now an active murder investigation." Murder investigation. 3 years too late, but the words were a balm on my wounded soul. Finally, my son was going to get the justice he deserved. Over the next week, my home, once a sanctuary of grief, became a crime scene. Forensic experts swarmed the house, authenticating the recordings, confirming they hadn't been tampered with. A voice recognition specialist verified that the voices belonged, without a doubt, to Robert and Sarah. Most importantly, A police-appointed mechanic was dispatched to the impound lot where Michael's Mustang had been sitting, collecting dust and rust for 3 years. Under the intense scrutiny of a homicide investigation, he found what the initial cursory inspection had missed: evidence of deliberate tampering. The cuts on the brake line were too clean, too precise, located in a place that made accidental damage impossible. The original investigation was routine, Detective Morrison explained to me during one of our many meetings at my kitchen table, the same table where I had served my son's murderers their last supper. Single vehicle accident, no witnesses, no obvious signs of foul play. The brake failure looked consistent with a 15-year-old car that the owner was known to work on himself. Frankly, Mrs. Foster, no one had any reason to suspect murder. "But you do now," I stated, not as a question. "Now," he confirmed, his eyes meeting mine. "We have more than enough to prosecute for first-degree murder and conspiracy. Your recordings establish premeditation, motive, and method. The physical evidence from the car corroborates the recorded confessions. It's an ironclad case." Sarah was arrested first. They took her from her real estate office, in front of all her colleagues. I heard later that she collapsed when they put the handcuffs on her and had to be practically carried out to the squad car. Robert was arrested the same afternoon at his office. The news hit our small town like a seismic shockwave. The local paper ran the story on the front page, a picture of me from a few years ago, next to photos of Robert and Sarah. Local man's accidental death reopened as homicide after widow uncovers shocking evidence. My phone began to ring off the hook, reporters wanting interviews. I declined them all. This wasn't about me. This was for Michael. The calls I did take were from friends and neighbors, their voices a mixture of shock, horror, and unwavering support. My sister drove up from Kentucky and refused to leave my side. My church circle organized a meal train, and my refrigerator was soon overflowing with casseroles and sympathy. The most difficult call came from Sarah's mother, Linda. "Margaret," she said, her voice broken by sobs, I don't know what to say. I can't believe Sarah would... I knew she was unhappy in the marriage, but never this. I never thought..." "Neither did I, Linda," I told her, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. If I had suspected for a single second, I would have warned Michael. "What's going to happen to Emma?" she cried, and that was the question that haunted my sleepless nights. Emma, sweet, innocent 5-year-old Emma. Her father was dead, murdered. Her mother and step-grandfather were his killers. Her grandmother, me, was the one who had provided the evidence to put them all in prison. What kind of a twisted, broken life was that little girl going to have? "I don't know," I admitted, my own voice cracking, "but I know Michael would want her to be taken care of, protected, and loved above all else." "Sarah's lawyer is going to say you did this for revenge," Linda warned, a hint of desperation in her tone. "That you never liked her, and you're using this to destroy her." I was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at Michael's empty garage. "Maybe there is some revenge in it," I said finally, my voice low. "I'm not going to pretend I don't want them to pay for what they did. But mostly, Linda, I just want the truth to come out. My son deserves that much." 3 weeks after the arrests, my new life of quiet solitude was interrupted by a call from the district attorney, James Chen. "Margaret, there's been a development. Sarah Mitchell's attorney has reached out. She's considering a plea bargain." "What kind of bargain?" I asked, my heart clenching. "She'll testify against Robert. A full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence. She's claiming Robert was the mastermind, that he manipulated her, that the murder was his idea and she was coerced." I wasn't surprised. Sarah had always been skilled at playing the victim. "What does that mean for the case legally?" "It means we're almost guaranteed convictions for both of them. Robert will get life without parole. With her testimony, the jury will see him as the monster he is. The question is whether you're comfortable with Sarah potentially serving 25 years instead of life." I looked around my kitchen, I saw the ghost of Michael sitting at the table, doing his homework as a boy. I saw him standing at the counter, making pancakes for Emma on a Saturday morning. I saw him looking out the window at the garage, that old Mustang, his pride and joy. 25 years. Sarah would be 53 when she got out. She would still have a life. Michael would still be dead. But Emma would have a chance to know her mother again someday. As an adult. Maybe, just maybe, that little girl deserved that chance. "Tell them I'll consider it," I said, my voice heavy. "But I want to hear what she's willing to admit to, in person." Some justice was better than no justice, and I was finally starting to understand that this wasn't just about punishing Robert and Sarah. It was about making sure Emma grew up knowing the truth, knowing her father was a good man, knowing that he was loved, and knowing that someone fought for him, even if it took 3 long, agonizing years. The plea bargain meeting took place on a grey, drizzling October morning, exactly 3 years to the day after Michael died. The poetic justice was not lost on me. Sarah was led into the DA's conference room wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. She looked nothing like the confident, put-together real estate agent who used to sit at my kitchen table. Prison had stripped her of her artifice. Her hair was lank and unwashed, her face pale and drawn. The moment she saw me, she began to cry. "Margaret, I'm so sorry," she choked out. "I know you can never forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am." I said nothing. My face was a mask of stone. I was there as a witness, not a confessor. Her lawyer laid out the terms. A full confession, testimony against Robert, in exchange for a sentence of 25 years with the possibility of parole. "Sarah," the DA said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I need you to tell Mrs. Foster, in your own words, exactly what you are admitting to." Sarah looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a despair so profound it was almost tangible. I had an affair with Robert. It started in July of 2024. Michael was getting suspicious. He was asking questions about why I was always over here, why I was so secretive with my phone. Her voice broke on the word love. "Robert and we talked about ending it, but we were in love." I felt bile rise in my throat. Love. She was calling the toxic, selfish obsession that killed my son love. "Continue, Ms. Mitchell," the DA prompted. "In January, Robert suggested that if Michael wasn't around, we could be together. At first, I thought he was just talking, but then he started getting serious. He started researching Michael's routines, his car maintenance schedule. He knew Michael always worked on the Mustang alone." "What specifically did Robert propose?" Sarah closed her eyes, as if she couldn't bear to see my face as she spoke the words. He said the brake lines were easy to access and easy to cut. He said that if we did it right before Michael drove to his monthly poker game in Canton, on that mountain road with all the curves, it would look like a perfect tragic accident. I gripped the arms of my chair, my knuckles turning white. They had planned it down to the very road where my son would plunge to his death. "And you agreed to this plan?" the DA pressed. "I didn't want to," she whispered. "But Robert, he said Michael would never give me a divorce. He said he'd fight for custody of Emma, that I would lose everything. He made it sound like it was the only way." "But you did agree," the DA stated. "Yes." The word was barely audible. "What was your specific role in the murder of your husband?" Sarah was sobbing openly now, her body shaking. "I was supposed to keep Michael distracted. The night before his poker game, I picked a fight with him. About money. I accused him of spending too much on car parts. While we were arguing in the house, Robert slipped out to the garage. You knew he was sabotaging the car at that exact moment," the DA clarified. "Yes." I closed my eyes, a wave of nausea washing over me. I remembered that night. Michael had called me, upset and confused after the fight. "Mom, she's being so unreasonable," he'd said, his voice full of hurt. I don't understand where this is coming from. And I, in my ignorance, had told him to give her some space, that all couples fight sometimes. I had told my son to be patient with the woman who was, at that very moment, acting as a decoy for his murderer. After it happened, Sarah continued, her voice ragged, Robert coached me on how to act, how to grieve properly, what to say to the police, what to say to you, what to tell Emma. You rehearsed your grief? The DA asked, his voice edged with disbelief. Robert said I had to be convincing, or people would get suspicious. He made me practice crying. He made me practice talking about Michael in the past tense. He made me practice being a widow. The room was silent, filled only with the sound of Sarah's wretched sobs and the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt a strange, cold detachment, as if I were watching a movie of someone else's life. This couldn't be real. Then Sarah's lawyer spoke up. There's something else, something that wasn't on the recordings. I looked up, my focus sharpening. Tell her, the lawyer prompted Sarah gently. Sarah raised her head, her gaze finally meeting mine directly. Robert wanted to wait longer before we went public, but I was getting impatient. That afternoon, the day you heard us talking in the kitchen, I had just told Robert that if we didn't make our relationship official soon, I was going to tell you everything myself. You were going to confess? I asked, my voice flat. No, she admitted, shaking her head. I was going to lie. I was going to tell you that Robert and I had fallen in love after Michael died. That we had found comfort in each other's grief. I was going to make it sound like it was all innocent, like it started after the funeral. But Robert said it was too risky, that you might ask too many questions. He wanted to wait the full 3 years, then divorce you, then marry me, make it look like a natural progression. She took a shuddering breath. So when you heard us talking, when he brought up the break lines, he was reminding me why we had to be so careful, why we couldn't rush things. The irony was staggering, a cruel joke played by fate. If Sarah hadn't been so impatient, if she hadn't pushed Robert to speed up their timeline, I might never have overheard them. I might have lived out the rest of my days in blissful, ignorant grief, sleeping next to my son's murderer. Mrs. Foster, the DA said gently, pulling me back to the present. Do you have any questions for Ms. Mitchell? I had 1,000 questions. I wanted to scream at her, to ask her how she could look our daughter in the eye every day. I wanted to know if she ever thought about Michael in those final, terrifying seconds. I wanted to know how she managed to stand at his graveside and throw a fistful of dirt onto his coffin. But there was only one question that really mattered. I looked at the broken woman in the orange jumpsuit. Do you think 25 years is enough? Her face crumpled. No, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Nothing will ever be enough. I know that. I know I destroyed Emma's life. I destroyed your life. I destroyed my own life. I know I killed a good man who loved me and who trusted me completely. 25 years, 50 years, a lifetime in prison. None of it will ever bring Michael back. She was right, but Emma would be 30 when Sarah was released. She would be an adult, able to make her own choices, and maybe by then, Sarah would have become someone worthy of a second chance from her daughter. I'll accept the plea, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt heavy, like stones, in my mouth. A wave of relief washed over Sarah's face, so potent it was almost obscene, followed immediately by a fresh wave of guilt for feeling that relief. Thank you, she whispered. I stood up to leave, my legs unsteady. I paused at the door and turned back one last time. Sarah, I said, my voice clear and cold. Emma is going to grow up knowing what you did. I will make sure of it. Someday, she will come to you and she will want answers. When that day comes, I hope, for her sake, that you are ready to tell her the absolute truth, all of it. She deserves to know who her father really was, and who you really were. I will, she promised, her voice a raw whisper. I'll tell her everything. I walked out of that office and into the cold October air, feeling the weight of the last 3 years begin, ever so slightly, to lift. It wasn't perfect justice. Perfect justice would be Michael walking through my front door, his arms full of groceries for Sunday dinner, Emma perched on his shoulders. But it was justice nonetheless, and for the first time since my son died, I could imagine a future where I might one day be able to breathe again. Robert's trial began 3 months later, in the depths of a bleak January. The courthouse was a media circus. I sat in the front row every single day, a silent, stoic figure in the eye of the storm. I wore Michael's high school ring on a chain around my neck, its familiar weight against my skin, a constant reminder of why I was there. Robert's slick defense attorney, Marcus Webb, argued that his client was the real victim, a lonely older man seduced and manipulated by a greedy younger woman. He painted Sarah as a sociopathic mastermind and Robert as her unwitting pawn. It was a disgusting but potentially effective strategy. Then I took the stand. For 2 days, Webb tried to break me. He painted me as a vengeful, bitter mother-in-law who had always hated Sarah. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Foster, that you never liked your daughter-in-law?" he sneered during cross-examination. "That's correct," I answered calmly. "I never liked her. Turns out my instincts were better than I thought." A few jurors cracked a smile. Webb pressed on, trying to discredit the recordings, my motives, my grief itself. "Why did you wait 2 weeks before calling the police, Mrs. Foster? Were you not editing the tapes to your liking?" I looked directly at the jury. "I waited because I needed to be sure. I needed to understand the full scope of their depravity, and I wanted to make sure that when I came forward, I had enough evidence to put them both away forever." "If someone murdered your child, Mr. Webb, wouldn't you want to be certain their killer would never walk free again?" When I stepped down, I caught Robert's eye. He was staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Good. Let him hate me. The trial was a parade of horror. The recordings were played in full. Sarah testified, via video link from prison, her voice a monotone of regret as she detailed their entire plan. But the real bombshells came from witnesses I never expected. First, Dave Richardson, Michael's old boss. He testified that in the weeks before his death, Michael had become paranoid, constantly checking his car, asking strange questions about automotive sabotage. He'd told Dave that his stepfather, Robert, had been asking a lot of technical questions about the Mustang's brake system. Michael had known something was wrong. He had sensed the danger. He just hadn't realized it was coming from inside his own family. The day before he died, he told Dave he was going to take the car to a mechanic for a full inspection right after his poker game. One day too late. The final devastating blow came not from a witness, but from my granddaughter. A few weeks before the trial, Linda had called me, hysterical. Emma had been playing with her dolls and had said something chilling. She had her mommy doll tell her daddy doll, "Daddy knows about the baby. We have to tell Grandpa Robert before Daddy gets mad." A baby. Through a child psychologist, the whole sordid story came out in court. Sarah had gotten pregnant with Robert's child in late 2024. Michael had found the pregnancy test. He knew the timing was wrong, knew the baby couldn't be his. He was demanding answers. He was on the verge of discovering the entire truth. Not just the affair, but the pregnancy. That was the real motive. They hadn't killed him because he was suspicious. They had killed him because he was about to expose them completely. They hadn't just murdered my son, they had murdered their own unborn child's future to cover their tracks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. At the sentencing, I gave a victim impact statement. I looked at the man I had spent 40 years of my life with, the man who had helped raise my son. "Your Honor," I said, my voice shaking but strong, "Robert Foster didn't just murder my son, he murdered his own unborn child's father. He systematically destroyed a family for his own selfish desires. He sat in my home for 3 years and watched me grieve for a son he himself had killed. There is no punishment on this earth that can fit the magnitude of that betrayal. Robert was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. I walked out of that courthouse into the cold January air, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt a sense of peace, not happiness. Happiness died with Michael, but a quiet, somber peace. Justice had been done. It's been a few years since the trial. I started a foundation in Michael's name, helping children who are victims of violent crime. Emma is my light. Linda and I co-parent, a strange alliance forged from a shared tragedy. I am slowly, painstakingly, teaching Emma about her father. I tell her he was a good man, a brave man who loved her more than life itself. One day, I will have to tell her the whole truth. I dread that day, but I know Michael would want her to know. I'm often asked if I'm bitter. The answer is complicated. I'm heartbroken that my son is gone. I'm devastated for Emma. I am enraged that I spent 3 years comforting the very people who caused my unimaginable pain. But I am not bitter. Bitterness is a poison that rots you from the inside out. I will not let them take anything more from me. Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who once slept in your bed and ate at your table. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to destroy the guilty. The recording equipment is still in my house. It's a daily reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried, has a way of coming to light. And sometimes, if you are patient enough and strong enough, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and please share your own stories in the comments. Your voice matters. We all deserve to be heard.